Of the Thrive with Asbury Seminary podcast. I'm your host, Heidi E. Wilcox, bringing you conversations with authors, thought leaders, and people just like you who are looking to connect with where your passion meets the world's deep needs. Today on the podcast, I had the privilege of talking to Dr. Michael Peterson, professor of philosophy and religion at the seminary. We talk about his recently released book, C.S. Lewis and the Christian Worldview. We'll link to this book in the show notes so you can pick up a copy if you haven't already done so. His book engages Lewis philosophically and provides a comprehensive framework for Lewis's worldview. We talk about things like the relationship between faith and science, the problem of evil, what we can learn from Lewis's worldview, and how we can appropriately apply it to our own lives. Let's listen. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for joining me today on the Thrive with Asbury Seminary podcast. I'm very excited to have you here and to get to talk about your book, C.S. Lewis and the Christian Worldview. So thanks for joining me today.
Well, you're certainly welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so you're a professor of philosophy and religion at Asbury Seminary. How do you like teaching at Asbury Seminary?
I love it here. I've been here about a decade, but I had spent several decades of my teaching career at the university level. And I was all about engaging culture and intellectual circles to help Christian belief seem rationally credible. And spent a lot of my career in that particular setting. But after coming here, I see that those same concerns translate very well, I think, and try to bring that particular dimension to seminary education of engaging culture and making sure we are good stewards of the intellectual aspect of Christian faith. So I am just having a ball.
Awesome. Awesome. What classes do you teach at the seminary?
Well, I teach the required philosophy of Christian religion, which is a very broad-based introduction, and everybody has to take that. And then I teach the C.S. Lewis course called C.S. Lewis and Christian Faith. I teach science and Christian faith because my PhD is actually in philosophy of science. I do quite a bit. Yeah, I do quite a bit with the you might call it the science-religion dialogue or the science-religion debate in general culture, which is everybody's got to be aware of that. So we tie into that in that course. And then I do a course on suffering and tragedy and Christian faith, which is about the problem of evil, problem of suffering. If God is good, why does this happen? Everybody knows that perennial human question.
Yes. What prompted your interest in C.S. Lewis?
I began reading Lewis as an undergraduate philosophy major, and mostly as just his philosophical works. And I thought they were a model of not just intellect and passion in presenting what I would call the reasonableness and the attractiveness of Christian faith. And Lewis was highly trained in philosophy. I think he's an excellent philosopher, but he's not a professional philosopher. He's a communicator to the general public. And so some of his critics, will say, well, he's not a technically precise philosopher. And in my view, they don't read him closely enough or sympathetically enough. But I could see from early on, when I began reading Lewis as an undergraduate, I could just see that so many of his ideas were rooted in very good philosophical background. And so even in my book, I try to give him a representation that is maybe a little more academic than some of his more popular books would seem. But it's the same idea as getting better representation at an academic level.
Yes, I really enjoyed reading your book, by the way, just so you know.
Oh, thank you.
Very good. Yeah. Have you read all of C.S. Lewis's works?
I have not read everything. I read mostly his philosophy books. There's just a handful. but he's got a lot of philosophical essays,
Yes, he does.
academic and collected books, with those essays compiled. Um, but particularly his scholarship on medieval literature and poetry, I don't read a lot, unless it has some part of it that's has a philosophical interest for me. Of course, with
Yeah.
our children, raising the children, we read the fantasy and the fiction.
Of course. What
It's
is your favorite work of Lewis?
actually my favorite is maybe his simplest,
Hmm.
and it's Mere Christianity. That's
Yes.
his series of radio broadcasts done during the war. And he bonded so much with the people in Great Britain by doing that and just trying to speak as a communicator to a wide variety of people during a very tough time about what Christianity really is all about. And so I think the reason it's my favorite is number one, you see a really erudite person knowing how to communicate in interesting ways and very clear ways. These are some of the best expressions. That's why the book is so much beloved in Christian literature. Just the clearest expression of Christian faith, and I think the part of it that I like the best is his Trinitarianism. He works in the book toward a view of God as Trinity, and he's a social Trinitarian, that God is a real fellowship of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And to be able to do that over BBC radio broadcasts in short little snippets, then it all gets put into that book. That's an amazing piece of communication on the one hand, and it's also incredibly Orthodox Christian in putting the Trinity at the center of Christian theology.
Yes, I had never heard the explanation of mere Christianity until I read your book, and it was talking about what the word mere means. I had thought it was just Christianity, but I was
Yeah.
really fascinated to hear that it was just pure, unmixed Christianity. I think to me, it gave the book a whole new meaning or a whole new dimension, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. A lot of people think they use the modern sense of mere, which means small or diminutive
Yes.
or insignificant or something like that. But no, he meant it to be unadulterated by non-essentials. And what he says in the early pages of the book is he's going to avoid denominational preferences and sectarian interests because those are off-putting to a non-believing public.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually put the believing community off in more narrow directions than they should be going as well. And so he tries to stick to just historic orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually had a revival in our day in the last several decades. The great Tom Oden, his work. We see N.T. Wright, his work. All now coming back to saying, yes, that's our guidepost, that's our touchstone is orthodoxy, not our denominational preferences and agendas.
Mm-hmm. Why is Lewis so revered then as a philosopher and theologian?
I think that the Christian community and Christians from so many different traditions, they just love Lewis. Although he's really not a professional philosopher and he's not a professional theologian.
Interesting.
He was trained in philosophy, he was trained in literature, and took prestigious honors in both fields. But he ended up in literature, technically a professor of literature both at Oxford and then later at Cambridge. I think it's because it's Lewis the communicator, and it's not just a kind of a bare intellectual truth. He has a rich imaginative life, and he knows how to communicate that. He knows how to communicate very well to people. And what he communicates is nourishing.
Mm-hmm.
It's significant, it's important, it's the deepest level of thought about God and thought about how to live our lives with God.
Mm-hmm. Yes, when I was reading your book and you pulled quotes from different pieces of his work, it just helped me think about God in ways that I may have had questions about or been thinking about, but maybe didn't have the words or the space in my head to think about it that way. So I would totally agree with that.
Oh, it's amazing. Some of the images he uses, the central image I think that he uses in all of his literature would be that of the great dance.
Mm-hmm.
And see, that's such a rich, colorful image. And it was thought of by St. Gregory of Nazianzus in the 5th century when he was reflecting on John chapters 14 through 17. When Jesus, there's also this language in those chapters. Jesus says, if you abide in me as I abide in the Father. And so this language of abiding or dwelling in, Nazianzus was reflecting on that and thought of God as a kind of a dance, a giving and receiving of mutual respect and honor and love. And he envisions the inner life of God being, quote unquote, the great dance. Mm-hmm. And Lewis makes that I think his signature image in all his works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It comes up late in Mere Christianity. And he also has about 10 pages devoted to it in Perelandra.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful image.
It is.
So earlier this year, in January, I believe it was, you published your newest book, C.S. Lewis and the Christian Worldview. So I was just hoping that you could give us an overview of this book so that I can learn more about it and that our audience can hear more about it as well.
Sure. The book came out in January in the U.S. I think it was out in April in the U.K. and worldwide. But I wanted that book to fill a gap, and I'd seen that gap literally for decades in all the writings about Lewis, the commentaries, and so on. I mean, works that are on his fantasy and fiction are abundant. And the retellings of his life story, his biography, are abundant.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a gap in engaging him philosophically. And, there are some books that do that, just a few, and a few essays or books of essays. But they're topical, they're selected topics. And I thought there's no book out there that gives a comprehensive framework for his worldview. And even if you look at my table of contents, which I've been working on that in my head for decades. I just never had time to write the book until recently. The table of contents is a kind of a template for how you can think about Christian worldview as Lewis approaches it. And so we treat his arguments for the existence of God, arguments from reason, morality, and joy, search for joy. Those three are distinctively Lewisian. Mm-hmm. And then his central ideas of incarnation and Trinity form the middle of the book. Those are very rich, if you ask me. He's amazing.
Yes.
And then it plays out on very important philosophical issues like problem of suffering, science and scientism, the problems of prayer and providence. I have a chapter on that.
Mm-hmm.
And the fate of the unbelieving, the fate of the unevangelized. I have a chapter on that. What do you do with people outside the faith who, through no fault of their own, have never heard the gospel, let's say, or never heard a credible presentation of the gospel?
Right.
Yeah. And so then once you have the build up through the middle of the book, it plays out on all these kinds of issues in the final chapters of the book.
Mm-hmm. What did you learn from your research and writing? Did you learn anything new as you wrote this book?
Well, I learned how vast the literature on Lewis really is. I knew it was vast, but just diving into it felt like diving into the ocean. I learned how much energy there still is for Lewis. It's amazing. I think it was at the turn of the millennium in the year 2000. I was looking at a survey by Christianity Today magazine on the best Christian books of the 20th century. And I think they surveyed, was it 100 or so of their best authors and consultants. And Lewis's books took the 7 of the top 10.
Wow.
And Mere Christianity was number 1.
Wow.
And Screwtape might have been number 2. Great Divorce was high. It's crazy.
Yeah. It's not surprising. I mean, were you surprised by that?
No, not. Well,
Okay.
I don't know whether I was surprised or I was just almost. I was almost to pass out that he'd take 7 out of 10. I thought a few, but 7 out of 10. But it just shows you that over time, the Christian community has really bonded with Lewis.
What would you say is the central element to Lewis's Christian worldview?
Well, I think that Lewis's idea of orthodoxy, that it's within historic Christian orthodoxy that we find clarity on who God is and how we properly relate to God. I think that when he envisions God as a Trinity, as we were mentioning, I think that's very central. And then his call to all people as whole persons, not just to be intellectual, but to use your intellect and to the best of your ability. Everybody's going to vary, but you have to use your intellect to find truth about God, but you also have to feel this almost existential or deeply personal need that God has built into us to search for him. And so you're coming to God ultimately as a whole person. And I know when you read Lewis's story, which I recount in the first part of my book, he's got all these different elements of his life that are not in balance. They're not together. They're out of sync. His mind is going one way. His emotions are going another. His mind as an atheist tells him there is not a universe that provides meaning and joy. And yet he has this deep need he just can't quite push away for meaning and joy. And that's a little bit different concept from just sheer truth and making an intellectual acceptance of truth. It's ultimately he's saying when you come to God, he gets all of you and he fixes all of you.
What can we learn from Lewis's faith journey and well thought out faith? Because you were talking about his journey from atheist to then accepting Christianity. So what can we learn from his journey?
I think for one thing, we learn that you have to keep pursuing. I'm thinking that maybe the most quoted biblical verse in Lewis throughout his writings is those who seek find. Those who truly seek will find. And that is really his life story. Almost 20 years of searching. From his early teens, when he lost his faith, when his mother died and his prayers weren't answered to save her, and she was his rock and his security. Then intellectually, he went to private boarding schools, and they damaged his faith severely. And so from early teens, he records being a non-believer and an atheist. And he didn't become a Christian until just around 30 years of age, 20 years.
Wow.
But he didn't give up. And partly that's the strength of that divinely given need for meaning and for joy. And so he's partly giving witness to that. And he's partly giving witness because he's thinking it through. He's got a lot of thoughts about this that he's picked up from different worldviews, and he's exploring all those different worldviews. So his intellect, his deep need in his heart, they're all working together eventually to bring him to that point of conversion. But it's almost 20-year search. So never give up or give up on anybody else.
Yeah. What was his tipping point, if you will, to accept the Christian faith?
I think, of course, it's a building process, and things were being built into his thinking that he may not have reacted to at the time. But he was wounded in the war. He read G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man while he was in the hospital. And for the first time during his atheist period of time, he saw the Christian outline of history and began to see the claim that Jesus was the central pivotal point of history. Then he moves to Oxford, gets his first job, put in the English department, and he's a cocky, arrogant atheist. And there's Tolkien, who's an Orthodox Christian believer and Catholic Christian who understands if you understand Orthodoxy and you intellectually process it, you're not going to be too terribly intimidated by a squeaky little atheist, to be really frank.
Right.
And so you get Chesterton, you get other things he was reading, you get Tolkien in his life speaking to him, you get all these influences that he eventually, it's almost like a combination lock. The different tumblers have to fall in place. And he's struggling too, because he knows if what they're saying is true, he'll have to give himself away to God. Mm-hmm. And he's very much self-controlling person. And so he began to struggle with even that. And I think that's a very typical human trait. You need to do this as the truth of Christianity looms larger in your thinking, but you're also resistant. So it's kind of like an approach avoidance. But he eventually gave in and believed in God, began going to church and chapel at Oxford, and then a short while later became a robust Christian and believed in Jesus. So that was actually a kind of a dual process, believing in God and then later, just a little later, believing in Jesus and becoming a Christian. But at any rate, that's I think the tipping point was probably if you look at what he says, his late night walk with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson around Addison's Walk. It's on the side of Magdalen College, Oxford. It's little woods with the lake, and there's a little dirt path. And they were talking about how he could think intellectually about the truth of the incarnation and the significance of the incarnation. He could believe in God, but to believe that God was identified with the historical person, Jesus of first century Nazareth, and all the meaning we invest with that, he couldn't come to. And so finally, that talk, he says, really reoriented his thinking, and he became a Christian shortly thereafter.
How can we because Lewis spent, as you said, 20 years exploring different things intellectually. How can we take his faith journey and study and then apply it appropriately to our own journeys?
Well, of course, I would say there's both the universal and the particular aspects, and it's the universal aspects that I think we have to key on if we're going to apply it to ourselves.
Okay.
If God builds human beings all the same universally, then there's going to be some commonalities, but then there are also going to be particularities that just you can't duplicate. They won't compare. And I think there'll always be that universal versus the particular way of analyzing. What was universal in humans, in Lewis's search, I think, was that there is a need to find truth. There's a need to find meaning and joy. And he pursued those. He was a good steward of his divinely given powers of reasoning, which were considerable. But he was also increasingly paying attention to this deep need, a human need for meaning. And those two threads weave together in Lewis's life. And so I think everybody has to pay attention to their own human nature, needing truth, needing meaning. Those are universals. and ultimately needing God, of course. But the particularities, are pretty hard to duplicate. The amazing education he had, his amazing abilities, we don't all have those. We have our different gifts, our different abilities, but those are hard to duplicate. I know particularly the way he expresses his need for joy. I personally don't relate to that. I don't have an emotional personality. And so I think, well, if people think that Lewis's quest for joy, lifelong quest for joy and meaning and fulfillment as a human being, which he didn't find in other worldviews, they didn't present a universe in which that's even possible. But if we take that and we go for the emotive language, the emotional language he uses, I'm thinking, I don't relate to that. So in the book, I try to make a point that we should pay attention to the universal human need for joy and meaning, but it's packaged differently in different people because of their own emotional structures. And I think that's a better way of applying Lewis. And what happened to Lewis in universal terms that should happen to all human beings. We should seek truth, meaning, and fulfillment in God.
What is the role of philosophers and theologians in our own faith? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, like,
Sure.
Lewis had after his exploration, he had his beliefs and way of thinking about faith and how Christianity worked, if that's an appropriate way to say it.
Yeah.
So how can what is that role? Like, because I think what I sometimes feel like, or I'm not sure if this is the right way, but like, he spent so much time thinking about it, so it must be correct, and therefore I should believe the same thing too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that Lewis would not want us to do that, of course, just believe on his prestige or his lovability. He would want us to believe what's true on its own grounds. And if he's helped us see those grounds, those logical grounds, the evidence, the reasoning he presents, the way it resonates with our humanity, all of these things are good grounds, and they all come together for Lewis. But he'd want us to own the process and not just take it secondhand from him, even though he certainly led the way and opened up a lot of ways of thinking and understanding to others, and he's much beloved for it. He'd want us to own it and think it through for ourselves. That can include reading philosophy and theology, and but not everybody is an academic or going to read some of the most technical and sophisticated stuff, and that's all okay. But we all have philosophical ideas, and we all have theological ideas. And it's important that those ideas be as clear and as accurate and helpful as we can make them according to our ability and our background,
Yes. No, I understand that. I think I'm getting to the point in my own faith where I'm like, my faith is definitely personal to me, but I want to understand more about it and how it works, instead of just being like, this is what the church has told me, or my parents have told me, my friends have told me. I want to understand and to be able to think through some of the things on my own.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So you said that you'd been a fan of Lewis, a scholar of Lewis, since undergrad. Are there any similarities between your faith journey and Lewis's faith journey?
I think on the universals, I think I was a kid who was not ever but not on the particularities. Like, I was never an official unbeliever or atheist, as he claimed to be early on. I was just a kid who was lost. Searching. I was a thoughtful kid, and so I validate the search just like Lewis validates the search. You've got to be on a search, and the biblical promise, of course, is that those who search earnestly and sincerely will find. And so, from my early teens, I was a searcher. That's true, and a thinker. I remember reading several dialogues of Plato. I remember reading Aristotle when I was 13 or so, something like that,
Oh, wow.
from a book club, a dollar book club. Hey, well, in my teens, you could buy books for $1,
Oh, wow.
but 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 at any rate, um, I think that the combination of good books and good friends in Lewis's background search is important, and I'd say the same for me. That particularly when I began dating a United Methodist minister's daughter in high school,
Yes.
my high school sweetheart, and she was getting me around her United Methodist minister family. Her dad was the local pastor of the Methodist Church. That was an amazing influence, and he would give me books to explain Christianity and so forth and take time with me. Uh, so for Lewis, it was Tolkien and Dyson and others influencing him. Um, and for me, it was the particular friends and uh, people in my life who influenced me. So I think that's a similarity. I think the similar emphasis on intellect, the similar emphasis on trying to communicate to others, help others to understand clearly the gospel and its claims. I think all those are some similarities. And by the way, we celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary in June.
Oh, wow.
No,
Congratulations.
no kid. Yeah, that's my high school sweetheart.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Thank you.
So, your book includes, I believe it was for the first time in publication, letters that Lewis and Thomas Van Osdol exchanged. Can you introduce us to these letters?
Yes, there are volumes, large volumes of Lewis correspondence, and when you put those things together, you always hope that all the different letters of Lewis that you can get a hold of and publish have come together. Um, and here, who would think? I mean, I guess you'd think, well, how do you ever know you've got them all? But a few years ago, as I mentioned in the book, in the appendix where they are present in the book, that a few years ago, Ashland University near Cleveland found these letters. Thomas Van Osdol was a scientist in their science department and wanted to write a book for the sort of general culture, explaining the role of science and how impactful, how influential it's been in general culture, and that it actually is something that religion needs to take account of and not be blind to or naive about. And it's a human achievement. It's a major human activity, and we have to encounter it correctly. And he thought that there was a way of sort of formulating a Christian engagement with science, but yet explaining real science, not fake science or not amateur science. And so he knew Lewis was the great communicator. This was in the early months, I guess more middle of 1963, the year Lewis died. And so Lewis was just in the process of becoming an invalid, but still answering fan mail and that kind of thing. And so we found 5 letters. They were given to the university by a friend of the family who'd, cleaning out the estate and things like that. And so the university has the originals on display in the library. But the letters ask about Lewis's advice, his advice on a science and Christianity volume. And you see it in the early letters. Lewis is giving some advice, and they're having a nice chat back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Then one letter by Van Osdol is missing, and the reply by Lewis was found, and that's the last letter, just almost a month or so before he died, and in November. So this would be maybe like in October. And it's totally changed. The conversation has changed. So we can only infer what Van Osdol's letter must have said. Because Lewis says, "I'm so sorry to hear of the death of your teenage son."
Mm-hmm.
So we're no longer talking science. And Van Osdol has revealed he lost his only son, his teenage son, in a car accident. and is grieving and not sure if he'll finish the book as expected, and those kinds of things. And so Lewis immediately switches to a sympathetic response, saying, I know exactly what you're feeling. I too know what it's like to have lost what you love most. Mm-hmm. And he's alluding, of course, to his own loss of his wife, Joy. Mm-hmm. And by a charming coincidence, he sought for joy all his life, found it in the Christian God, and then he married, late in life, the American woman named Joy.
I thought that was beautiful and really funny.
But he taps into his own sorrow and his own sense of loss from a few years before when he had lost Joy. And it's a very human letter. It's a great letter. Mm-hmm. Very human Lewis.
Yes. Very empathetic and compassionate.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How did you get access to these letters?
Well, the president of Ashland at the time called me. He knew I had written some stuff on Lewis, and he knew me, and called me and said, would you come up and we'll do a kind of an unveiling of these letters, and you will speak about their importance and talk a little bit about Lewis. And since Van Osdol was a scientist and much beloved by the university there, he says maybe do something that touches on science. And so I put together a talk and did that. And before I left, I mentioned to them that I wanted to do this book and I'd like to touch base with them and get facsimiles or something of those letters and their permission to reprint. And so that eventually developed and they were in the book. But I was just invited. Kind of out of the blue. I didn't expect it, but to come and be part of the sort of a public relations event, which, being identified with Lewis gives every institution prestige that can do it.
Yes, how cool is that? What an opportunity.
I don't think it was being identified with me.
So, Dr. Peterson, as we're talking about Thomas Van Osdol and C.S. Lewis and faith and science, what is the relationship between those two things?
Well, speaking for Lewis, so to speak, and that would be my own view as well, science is an important human activity spawned by God-given gifts of intellect and the ability to inquire and learn truth about his world or parts of his world. Usually we say the physical world, nature, and all the different sciences of nature. And Lewis, he was broadly educated, mostly in the humanities, philosophy, literature, but he respected mainline science, and he had a pretty good understanding of its methodology, that it was kind of religiously neutral. Science wasn't about answering religious questions. Is there a God? Is there not a God? That's hardly a scientific question, and there's no scientific answer. And so he was very wary of attempts to use amateurish interpretations of science, either to prove or to disprove faith, or questions that were not scientific questions. I would say Lewis's very sane approach is to say, within the Christian worldview, all of life and reality make sense and fit together. And science and its study of nature is part of all of reality, and it's within the Christian worldview that its very existence makes sense. That we have a rational world able to be physically studied, understood, and in some worldviews, that's hard to get. And how about the rationality that humans exhibit in science? Some worldviews don't even support rationality all that well. And Lewis was particularly an opponent of secularism and naturalism and materialism, those kinds of attitudes that he thought were the dominant worldview of secular Western culture.
Mm-hmm.
We call it naturalism. And naturalism believes that the world came about by chance, and it's only physical. There are no supernatural beings. And if that's the case, Lewis asks in his argument from reason, how in the world reason, the ability to think logically, ever occurred in a naturalistic universe? So he's already, in his argument from reason, which occurs in his book Miracles, actually, he's already suggesting that really only a worldview that supports rationality in a full and robust way could support science.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also need a rational, coherent world to study. And he, once again, looks at other worldviews and says Christianity says it best. A rational God created a rational world to be rationally studied.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's more the relationship than some of these attempts you see all the time in popular religious literature of trying to use science to prove God's existence, or also popular and academic literature that thinks science disproves God.
Mm-hmm.
So at any rate, that's, I think, a way of looking at what Lewis is doing. He's appreciative of mainline science, not trying to deny it or be threatened by it, but to frame it, to say what kind of a world its very existence can occur within.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that makes sense. So you were talking about this a little bit, but I have to ask too.
Sure.
With the intellectual side of Lewis's faith, where is the faith element for him and then for us as well?
Very good point. I think he views faith holistically, meaning that it's not just a feeling or a choice. You hear that occasionally. But it's the whole person, and the whole person includes the intellectual, the need for truth, the need for understanding, so that not everybody can be an academic or read sophisticated theology and philosophy, but they still have a need for truth and understanding within the limits of whatever capacities and gifts and background we have. So in that regard, that's a universal that all humans need to find truth about God. And within that context of mentally or intellectually understanding the truth about God, we respond in trust and faith.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you get a kind of a blind faith or emotional faith without guidance by truth. So a lot of his journey, for example, could be interpreted as him looking for a mental framework within which he could exercise valid faith. And he found it after about a 20-year search.
Yeah, that makes sense. Why is it so important to have a well thought out faith, or as Lewis would put it, to align ourselves with reality in our intellect and our faith?
Yeah. Lewis, one of his recurring themes is that in coming to God and exercising obedient faith in God, we are aligning ourselves with reality. And he uses a capital R.
Mm-hmm.
So all of life, actually, outside of religious concerns, is partly a process of aligning ourselves with reality. When I know how reality is, and I'm not mistaken about it, then I know the truth. Right now I'm sitting in a chair and I have to respond appropriately to the kind of reality that chair is. I can't float in the air, and I can't do certain things. It's got its own reality that I can't create, I can't change. I'm responding to it as we talk. And Lewis's point is that God is a reality we don't invent, we can't change the terms on which we are to have relationship with him. And so in aligning myself with the reality that's God, I have to be the one who changes. I have to submit, obey, allow myself to be transformed because I can't come to God and make demands. I'd like to be this way or I'd like to be that way. It's really much more about having his life take root in our lives and grow in our lives and transform us in ways that he chooses. So that's something that, number one, for Lewis, has the intellectual aspect. I have to understand this about God. I have to own it intellectually, but then I have to personally live into it.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like you have to know the truth and live the truth.
Good point. I think that's what he's saying, really.
Okay. So with that, one of the quotes that you used in your book from Your Christianity really stood out to me about how we search for Christ. And so the quote was, as long as your own personality is what you're bothering about, you're not going to him at all. Look for Christ and you will find him. And so that really kind of puzzled me, because I'm not sure what it means to truly seek Christ. Because I mean, for me, a lot of times I think about, oh, I got really frustrated at this person. I need to change that about me. So how can we truly seek, or not, I need to change that about me, but you know what I mean? Like that's something that I need God to work on. And so for me, it sometimes does revolve around my outward actions. So what does it mean to truly seek Christ?
Yeah, excellent question. I think using that quote, that as long as you're bothering about your own personality, you're not really going to find Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It is a super quote. He says that in so many different ways in different writings. His point, I think, is the human problem of self-obsession, self-control, self-preoccupation is one of his big targets.
Mm.
And we often want to come to God for selfish reasons. Either we keep ourselves from coming to God because we don't want to give up control. That was his problem. But even in coming to God, you can come for reasons that are less than worthy or less than positive, like you want something. And he's partly saying you have to come to God for who he is in himself. And you can't be preoccupied with your own self and your own sort of prescription for how you'd like to come to God, what you'd like God to do for you, X, Y, and Z. That particularly comes out in Great Divorce. In the Great Divorce, this dream of people in the realm of the damned going to heaven to see if they could maybe like to stay there. But then they'd have to conform to reality, of course.
Yes.
And they were enjoying their unreality, which is hell. For Lewis, that's unreal. So they encounter many of these people who are just visiting. They're ghosts. They're insubstantial. They're not fully real because they haven't given themselves to God and wanted to be in heaven. And they may see a loved one who's deceased and in heaven and want to be with the loved one, but they will be told, well, you can be here if you'll give yourself to reality. Let God himself change you. And they'll say, you mean I could get to see Reginald, or I could get to see this other person, or I could get to do this or that if I come to God? And then the advice is, no, you can't come that way. You have to come to God because you need God, and everything else will fall into place. But you can't use God as a means to your end. God is an end. He's an end in himself. That's so interesting. Now, I should probably add that Lewis, early in life, sort of believed that early in his Christian life, you come to God purely as a matter of principle, because he's the ruler of all, and we're the subjects, and we finally acknowledge that. But really, as his thought about Christian conversion matured, he realized most of us don't come exactly that way, and you can't say you can't come to God unless you do it out of the right principles. That there's this deep, divinely given need, a need for God, a need for meaning, a need for joy, and that drives us as well. And is it selfish? Well, it's certainly about ourselves. It's about our deep need that God gave us. As Augustine said, and Lewis was a big fan of Augustine, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." And so pursuing that need is not irrational. It's not unproductive. So he believes in that as well. Pursue truth and pursue meaning. But he was really pointing out lesser motivations like using God to get what I want, or get to some other good that's less than what conversion and Christian life is really all about. He points a lot of that out in Great Divorce. Some of that comes out in Screwtape as well. Studying human personalities and their way of rationalizing how not to square up to God.
Can some of those lesser reasons for coming to God help you get to the deeper reason and the ultimate reason for coming to God?
I think so. I don't think God is, you think about this. The amazingly humble God who will take us on virtually any terms. Who knows what motivations we might have? Who knows what kind of confusions we might have? But come to him, it'll all start working out. I think that's a big theme in Lewis. He didn't come to God perfectly, you know what I'm saying, according to some prescribed method. None of us, I don't think, do come in some perfectly prescribed method. We come how we come, the needs we have. I think his mature reflections on that process allow him to pick out some themes like our need for truth, our need for meaning. But yes, just being fearful, just being needy. If it brings you to God, hey, it's all part of prevenient grace. It's all part of the grace that seeks and draws.
So I want to ask about Lewis and the problem of evil and how he reconciled that with a loving God, especially because right now, as we're recording, we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. So we're all kind of dealing with some version of the question, if God is loving and good, how did this happen?
Yes, excellent question. It's the perennial human question. And Lewis knew that and wrote a whole book, The Problem of Pain, where you get kind of his academic answer to that. And briefly, he wove together two elements to talk about why God would create a world like this. That a loving, good God would create a good world that allows for us responding to God or rejecting God, and having relationships to others. He says, what kind of features have to be part of that kind of world? Well, there has to be a structure to nature. There have to be natural laws. Nature has to have a regular operation as our context for action and response. Also, we have to have a very robust kind of free will where we can do some amazingly good things or some very, very bad things. And that's within our range of free will. It's a very risky kind of world for God to create, but there's no relationship without risk. In marriage or in friendship or in other interpersonal contexts, if there's power and control, you destroy relationship automatically. That's a law of life. So Lewis paints a picture in Pain of a world that's got these two features, natural laws, free will, and the point of that world is to allow us to grow toward God if we will choose and build relationship with God. So that's his academic answer, and he's often almost oversimplified by people who quote some of these things, that pain is meant to get our attention and make us return to God. And it certainly can do that, or it can turn us against God because it's so intense. People react differently. So sometimes his interpreters, I think, aren't fair to just the sheer riskiness that he's trying to suggest. So many goods, so many pleasures, so many wonderful things to do in God's world, but there's so many ways to go wrong. It's a strange mixture that creates the question: why would a God create a world that turns out like this?
Yeah.
And his point is that it's not controlled. It's a risk. It's a relational risk, and that we should be thankful for the life we have, do the best by it, turn to God, live into God, and we will have done what this world it was meant to offer us. Mm-hmm. Now, on the personal level, not the academic so much, when the bachelor Lewis late in life married Joy Gresham, this American woman who was a fan and a reader and an accomplished poet on her own. They married, and he said, I found a happiness that I didn't think would ever come my way. And then soon thereafter, she's diagnosed with cancer. It's eating away her femur. And there's a lot of pain, suffering. The treatments were hard. They pray. They think she might be healed. She's not healed. She dies, and an agonizing death. And he witnesses all of this, and he's torn up about this. He's just heartbroken. So his academic answer from pain, he should have said, well, it's a risky world. Natural processes didn't go our way, and that's that. But, of course, that's an academic answer, and he began to feel it very personally when he lost her. It changes things. And it's not that the academic answer is false. It's that the academic answer is not the whole answer.
Right.
And so Lewis is actually angry, thinking that this should never have happened. It's a very personal, deeply personal thing. He writes his book, A Grief Observed, which is kind of a diary where he journals all of his thoughts and feelings, and there's anger at God, questioning God, wondering what it's worth to be Christian if you can't have things go well. And basically by the end of the book, he's saying, I'm calming down. I've processed my emotions. I feel like I've got a deeper faith, but it's not a faith that is untried and has never suffered. And I see that happiness can include suffering. So I have happiness with God, but suffering now has been part of my happiness. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. So he's got the academic answers, which I think are exactly correct, actually. Natural law, free will, makes a chance a universe, but it's the chance to do good, it's the chance to do evil, and we must choose. But we're also set in this physical setting, which is not always going to give us the most pleasant experiences. We will get sick. We will lose loved ones. It's a strange world in that regard, but it's a world where we can touch one another, where we can have all sorts of opportunities to do good and be thankful for those opportunities. So at any rate, I would say that the fragility of life in this world is still a gift, but it is fragile. And he emphasizes that considerably in both his academic and his personal reactions. And to put those two books together, Problem of Pain, Grief Observed, is an amazing exercise. And see how he's dealing with two levels.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting how when he was grieving Joy's passing, it ended up ultimately bringing him closer to God because of how he processed his grief and processed it with faith. But then earlier in his life, of course, he was much younger and not as mature and things like that. But his mom's death drove him completely away from faith.
That's exactly correct. It's how you respond. It's not the event.